Hey, creative souls, writers, word witches. In this video, I will be talking about inclusive writing. We'll go over what it is, why it's important, and how to incorporate it into your writing practice and your writing life. And I will give you some examples. Before we get started, I want to say thank you for being here, for tuning in, and for all of your likes, shares, and subscribes, and your comments. Your presence and engagement go a long way in helping me grow. And this is important to me because I am invested in growing a community of like-minded creatives who embrace the power of story to heal. If you're new here, I'm Johnny. I'm a retired adjunct writing professor, and these days I call myself a word witch. I'm a practicing witch, and I've been helping beginning and intermediate writers work magic on the page for over 20 years. I believe I'm on this earth to heal the world through stories, whether it's the ones that I write and tell or the ones I help you write and tell. I do believe stories can heal, so let's do it together. All right, let's get started with this topic of inclusive writing. First, I want to say that I have at times received pushback and backlash from some students in the past when I bring up this subject. So if the idea of being open to learning how to write inclusively, and by that I mean not misrepresenting people who are different from you, if that makes you mad or defensive, all I ask is that you don't leave any angry, shitty comments here. And if you do, we will remove those and block you from the channel. So heads up. If you, on the other hand, are on board with learning more about this subject, or if you're already mindful of whether or not your writing is inclusive, please stick around. All right, inclusivity is more than just a trend. It's really a necessity, and especially, I think, considering the current political climate that we're faced with right now. This is not, so by this, I mean writing inclusively is not about being too woke or being too snowflake or any of those other bullshit attempts that right-wing MAGA idiots toss out when they're met with ideas of individuals that challenge their highly privileged status quo. As writers, I think it's important to give serious thought to what we bring into the world through our words, right? Because words have power, and the effects of our stories can be so far-reaching. Creating stories that reflect our diverse world and offering readers from all backgrounds the opportunity to see themselves on the page really is essential to evolving as storytellers so that we can do our part to make the world a better place. But what does inclusive writing really mean? And why does it matter? Well, let's first take a look at the principles of inclusive writing and why it's essential. And then we'll get into how you can integrate this into your work if you're not already. Inclusive writing is the practice of consciously crafting language, characters, and narratives that represent a more broad spectrum of human experiences. So it seeks to avoid biases, stereotypes, and exclusion while representing different identities, abilities, cultures, and perspectives, and doing that with accuracy and respect. This approach, of course, applies across various forms of writing, from fiction and nonfiction to marketing materials and academic writing. At its core, inclusive writing is about being intentional and thoughtful in the words that you choose and the stories that you tell. And for this video, because this is my focus, the focus will be on fiction. So here are some key aspects of inclusive writing. Diverse character representation. This means creating characters from different racial, ethnic, gender, and ability backgrounds without reducing them to stereotypes. It's also about respectful language. So using words that align with how groups self-identify and avoiding outdated or offensive phrasing. It's just like in real life. If someone wants to be called they rather than she or he, why not? What's to be gained by purposefully not respecting their request? What's to be gained by dismissing it or diminishing them or making jokes? Nothing at all. Except maybe to live under the illusion of propping up a pretty big yet frail ego. That's all that is. Avoiding harmful tropes is another way we can be more mindful and inclusive. It's best to stay away from cliches or oversimplified portrayals that represent or diminish certain groups. And here's one that a lot of people don't think about: accessibility considerations. So this is about taking care to use language that is clear, readable, and available in formats that accommodate people with disabilities. So one thing I've recently started doing is making the fonts on my blog posts bigger and my emails as well, because the default text oftentimes is pretty small. So I take the time to change the size of each block of text on my blog post so that they can be more accessible to more people. Now let's talk about why inclusive writing matters. Political correctness, respect, and compassion are only part of the reason behind the need for inclusive writing. It's also about authenticity and responsibility. I think we as writers, as creators, have a responsibility about what we put out into the world and what we want to perpetuate. Okay, so it's important for those of us who write fiction to create worlds that do the following, that reflect the real world. And this is true even if you're writing fantasy. And by real world, I mean showing the vast array of people and beliefs and cultures that we see in our daily lives. Of course, if you write fantasy, you can create your own version of that. So for example, I recently served as an event partner for a YA fantasy writer. She is a disabled writer and her protagonist is also disabled. And so this is what I'm talking about. Bringing in real world elements into any kind of story is really important at this point in our evolution as a species. The world is diverse, so the stories that we tell should be too. And readers tend to connect more deeply with stories that acknowledge and celebrate different identities and experiences and perspectives, especially when they see and live them every day, whether through their own lived experience or in the experience of those around them, people that they're close to. Inclusive writing also encourages empathy and understanding, and we need a whole lot of that right now. Stories have the power to shape the perceptions of our readers. When readers encounter characters and narratives that differ from their own experiences, they are presented with an opportunity to learn and develop a greater understanding of others. And like I said, don't we need that right now? More than ever, it seems. At least in my lifetime. At least since I've been an aware adult, an aware person in the world. Inclusive writing creates a wider audience. And this is good for you as a writer. In short, it broadens your readership. So when people see themselves accurately and respectfully depicted on the page, they are more likely to engage with and share your work. And that is always a good thing. If you're a writer who wants to get their work out into the world, this is absolutely what we want. Inclusive writing also challenges harmful norms. So when we think about it, if we look back, historically, literature has really, in many, many cases, been shaped by dominant narratives that exclude or misrepresent marginalized groups. Inclusive writing helps to dismantle these outdated perspectives and structures and really push for more equitable storytelling. So this isn't about anybody telling you what you can and can't write about, not at all. It's more about looking inside your own lived experience and discerning how to include people not like you as fictional characters in your stories so they can resemble the people you likely know and see on a regular basis in your life. Inclusive writing also enhances creativity. Think about it this way. A commitment to writing inclusively encourages richer, more complex storytelling, which will both push you as a writer and make your stories better. It will also allow you to explore new perspective settings and conflicts that you might otherwise overlook. And isn't that one of the reasons that we write? I love this quote by Anais Nin. She said, "We write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospect." So if you don't already, I hope that you will embrace the practice of inclusive writing for your own benefit, because it won't only enhance your writing and your practice, it will also enhance your life and your perspective and understanding of the world. So, okay, let's talk now about how to put these principles into action. Here are several ways to make your writing more inclusive. This one is probably obvious to a lot of people, but it's worth mentioning. Instead of defaulting to masculine terms, opt for gender-neutral alternatives. So instead of mankind, use humanity or humankind. Instead of chairman, use chairperson or chairwoman. Instead of he or she, use they when applicable. And I want to give you a little aside here for a minute, and it has to do with this last one, using they versus he and she. I knew someone recently, so we met a few years ago, and he knew that I mentor people who write. So he asked me to help with his memoir, and this was when I was doing mentoring for memoirs. We had a few conversations about his manuscript over dinner, and in those conversations, I saw a side of him that surprised me. I was surprised because he was a college professor, and I figure that most people in academia have a certain awareness about the world. This has at least been true for the ones I have known and worked with, even those who are my age or older. He, on occasion, went on a rant about how young people who he was teaching, and I worked with him directly before he retired, and he was well into his 70s, okay? He would go on these rants about how young people are so caught up in pronouns. And he would get very animated and vocal about the use of the pronoun they. And he talked about how problematic it was when writing. And by the way, he wasn't a writing professor or an English professor. And while I could understand what he was getting at, it has changed the way we have to think about writing, but big deal. It's happened before. We've done it before. Why not with this? You should have seen his face when I told him that I consider myself a she, her, and a they, them. But people can call me she, her, and I'm totally fine with it. It's not something that is all that important to me because I feel that either fits for me and I'm comfortable living in the skin of either. So his face absolutely dropped and he looked so confused and I never heard from him again. And fortunately, this was the end of our time working together and we had developed a kind of friendship and had even talked about staying in touch. But that just didn't happen, all because of this thing, as far as I can tell. So you just never know about people. But I think it's important, at least for me and how I want to move about in the world, to be instrumental in progress and to not get stuck in our ways and to really be open to the evolution of humanity. And that's what inclusive writing is about. Another way we can incorporate inclusive writing into our work is to develop well-rounded characters. We want to avoid tokenism. We want our characters to be diverse and have depth and agency. And a character's identity really should be an integral part of who they are, but not the only defining trait. So let me give you some examples. Instead of a one-dimensional LGBTQ plus character whose entire personality revolves around that identity, create a fully fleshed out individual with hobbies, relationships, and personal struggles beyond their sexuality or gender identity. Here's another example. Instead of a flat cardboard character of color who serves only as a support to enhance the white protagonist's quest, write them as a well-rounded human with capabilities, likes and dislikes, and desires found in anyone, and give them equal time, energy, and importance in the story and its outcome. Another area that gets overlooked in storytelling and in life is ageism. So think about how people over the age of 50 are portrayed in stories. Films are a great place to start. And further, think about how men over 50 are portrayed as opposed to women over 50. So a brief story here. When I was in grad school, I wrote a paper about how age gap relationships are represented in film. And it wasn't uncommon then, and probably still isn't now, to see age gaps between men and women shown differently, depending on which one was the older. This was a while back, but not that far back. It was, I don't know, in the mid 2000s, around 2005-ish, somewhere in there. So I think it's worth mentioning still. And I found numerous films at that time that revolved around a storyline of the woman being older in the romantic relationship. That's what the whole freaking story was about. And I didn't think ahead to gather a list of them for you, but two that come to mind are How Stella Got Her Groove Back and Harold and Maude. And there's another one I remember, I don't recall the name, but it was with Mel Gibson when he was much younger, and he was the younger man in the relationship. And he was also developmentally challenged. And so that added another layer of, oh no, this is so taboo, right? Whereas at the same time, probably still now, we were seeing in films the opposite being true, with the man being older, but it was just a given, right? The story was about something completely different. Their age difference was never mentioned, but it was obvious. And like I said, might still be true. I haven't tracked this in a while, so I'm not sure. But start to look at these things and keep these things in mind if you're not already. Okay, moving on. Another thing we can do is be mindful of cultural representation. When writing about cultures different from your own, research thoroughly and avoid exoticizing or appropriating elements without really understanding their significance. For example, instead of depicting an indigenous character as a mystical guide, we've seen that a lot, explore the nuances of their lived experience and traditions with depth and accuracy. So again, this is about lived experience. It's about what's in people's hearts, not what we see on the outside, not what we've been shown over and over. So really look into the lived experience, the lived lives of indigenous characters, okay? It's really easy to gloss over people and cultures who are othered because they don't get a lot of representation. So how do we know unless we are of a particular culture or know someone who is? Well, it takes work. It takes doing research. It takes asking them so that you get it right. And my guess is that most people, if you tell them, hey, I'm writing this novel, I'm writing it about your culture, or I have a character who is from your culture and I really want to get it right. Can you talk with me for a bit and share some things with me so that I don't make a mistake? My hunch is that most people that you approach in that way would be happy to sit down and talk with you. Another example in this realm is rather than leaning on stereotypes, put characters of cultural backgrounds different from your own in real scenarios. Okay? So, for instance, imagine a Latina character pursuing a cure for a disease while attempting to maintain difficult family ties. Because when we develop characters to make them more human-like, they don't have a single monolithic focus. What makes them interesting is the variegated aspects of their lives. That's what makes people real to us. That's what makes characters real to our readers. Okay, another example here might be a Black character as a successful entrepreneur with a case of imposter syndrome, or an Asian character pursuing a career as a ballerina who also has a secret chronic illness. All right, another way that we can incorporate this into our writing is to represent disabilities accurately and respectfully. Characters with disabilities should not be defined solely by their conditions, nor should they be used as inspirational props. And we see this a lot. So an example of how you might remedy this problem is instead of portraying a blind character as having a superhuman hearing, depict them as an individual, just making their way through the world in a way that aligns with, again, real life experiences. Just like with the indigenous cultures I mentioned earlier, it's all about real life. It's about being human and having feelings and dreams and desires and struggles. Another example might be rather than write a storyline wherein a disabled character overcomes their disability to be normal, write a story showing the character's perseverance, maybe in getting accommodations they deserve, with the world bending to meet them rather than them being required to fit in. Or a storyline of a sought-after attorney who requires a wheelchair, with the story being about their expertise and success in winning cases, not about their physical ability. Another thing we can do, and this is my last point before I get to some final thoughts, we can avoid harmful tropes and stereotypes. Be conscious of overuse and damaging portrayals of marginalized groups. It's really that simple. And it's also complicated. I know. Some common pitfalls to avoid include, and these are in addition to some that I talked about in a recent video on tropes and a blog post also. I'll put a link to the blog post in the description, and then I will link to the trope video and you can click on that from up above. All right, so here are some other tropes. The tragic queer trope, where an LGBTQ plus character is doomed to suffer or die. And we see this oftentimes too with people of color, where they're there to fill space or as a prop for a white protagonist, and they're kind of just treated as a throwaway character. Another trope is the magical minority, where a character of color exists only to guide, like I just said, the white protagonist. Think about the film The Help. Another trope is inspiration porn. And this is an approach to disability, and it's not a good one. And this is where a disabled character exists solely to inspire able-bodied characters. And if you haven't been aware of some of these tropes, you will start to notice them now that I've mentioned them. And you will hopefully see why they're so problematic. Okay, some final thoughts. Inclusive writing is an ongoing process of learning, unlearning, and refining your craft. It requires us to be open, to research, and to be willing to engage with feedback. When we strive for inclusivity, we can contribute to a literary world where more people feel seen and valued and understood. And whether you're writing a novel, a short story, or a screenplay, really taking the time to consider inclusivity does improve your work and helps you create stories that resonate with a diverse and evolving readership. And you don't have to conquer every harmful trope or stereotype in one fell swoop. It's okay to start small. Just stay curious and keep learning. And you can also hire a sensitivity reader if you're not sure, which I'll talk about more in an upcoming video. The bottom line, though, is your words have power to shape a world that's more inclusive, that's kinder, that's more compassionate. And that, in my opinion, is real power. All right? So lovely, writer. As always, I send you mad writing mojo. Happy writing.